an essay that I really liked from early on in the Substack was kind of about the ways that that racial justice arguments play out, in the U.S. And the ways that like that sort of goes back, what like the interplay between kind of symbolic gestures about this stuff and substance. The essay is called, I think it was just Perhaps We Can't Do Both.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what that was a week that was where the race conversation was dominated by the treatment of Meghan Markle in the British royal family. And I just found it so amazing that a movement that was not started by, but which was kickstarted by, or was so propelled by the murder of I guess lower middle class or working class black men on the streets in Minnesota, that we now are spending our time talking about a woman who is absolutely someone who suffers under prejudice and racism, because everybody who's black does, and I totally acknowledge that, and that sucks. But she's among the wealthiest human beings on earth. She's certainly among the most famous human beings on earth, one of the most influential. In terms of her safety and security and overall quality of life, she's someone who is doing as well as, she's easily in the top, 0.1% of the human species, right? And yet our racial dialogue was just captured by this story. And one of the things that I try to always say is, people talk as though we do not have such a thing as an economy of attention, or that, as if attention and energy and sort of psychic, power that's being expended on these things, that these are limitless resources, and they're not, right? When we are covering one thing, we're not covering another. The number one, racism and white supremacy are big and multifaceted and have lots of different components. But if you say the biggest thing that separates black and white people in terms of the average black person, and sort of how it impacts their life the most, it's the black-white income gap or wealth gap, right? It is the economic difference between these two races. That gap.
Yeah, I think just to interject, I mean, George Floyd was murdered after the cops were called on him, because he was trying to pass a bad 20, at a convenience store. I think shortly after being laid off. Yeah. So I mean that that one detail, does paint a little bit of a picture by itself.
Yeah, and I think that, and that's and it touches every black person, right? It is true that there's a disproportionate number of black people who live in urban centers where there's high crime, higher drug use, and more violence from the police. That's true. But there's also, millions upon millions of black Americans who are lower middle class or middle class who don't live in those environments, and for whom those problems are not everyday issues, but yet who still suffer under the black-white wealth gap because they simply have fewer resources. You can go days on Twitter with a timeline full of people who talk about racial issues without anyone using the phrase black-white wealth gap, right? It just doesn't get talked about. And, Meghan Markle over that issue, to me, is an indication of the brokenness of our racial conversation. The other thing is, if Meghan Markle, one of the things that developed in this conversation was you could not talk about Meghan Markle as anything other than someone who faced the full force of racism, right? In other words, saying something like, yes, it's terrible that that people are expressing prejudice against her, but she's very wealthy. She's literally part of dynastic royalty now. Those details were very explicitly denied and said that that's racist if you say that. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, if someone in Meghan Markle's position cannot be said to have been rescued more or less from the force of racism, what hope do we have for it at all, right?
Right.
If a person who's that wealthy, who's that powerful, that influential, that famous, who is in the British royal family, if that's someone we have to look at and we can only define her through her oppression as a racialized figure, then we should just give up, right? Because I don't care how generous the reparations are going to be if we can get a bill like that passed. They're not going to bring the average Black person to the status of Meghan Markle. And I think that just speaks to this nihilism about race that we've developed, which is that, like, if you acknowledge that progress is possible and that some people are more or less, some Black people are more or less victimized by racism, that's seen as like not taking it seriously enough. But what it really means is that you're saying there's no hope, right? Because most Black people are never going to be Meghan Markle. And if what she's got is not good enough, then I don't know what good enough could possibly be.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. And it's also, I mean, even, you can separate out some of what people mean by, systemic or structural racism, which are sometimes frustratingly vague phrases, like especially when now in the post-George Floyd movement, when I hear like centrist Democrats using these phrases, I always really want to know what structures or systems, that they're thinking of, right? Certainly not capitalism, but
Right.
But like one thing, that it can mean is just sort of lasting disparities, due to past oppression and discrimination, which are certainly solved by by redistribution, of wealth and power, and whatever form that takes, right? And you can have that whole sort of Ta-Nehisi Coates, Adolph Reed kind of debate about exactly how the redistribution should happen, whether it's racially targeted or through universal programs. But even if what people are often talking about is just prejudice in people's heads, which is sometimes explicitly what some people mean by structural racism. That's the P+P definition, prejudice plus power, and it still seems like a pretty, you don't want to speak too confidently about what would happen in the future, especially with like more diffuse cultural issues. But certainly every society in which some kind of ethnic or religious or linguistic, racial community is has like that status of an impoverished underclass, it does seem pretty universal that people like tell themselves some sort of story about how they deserve it, so they don't have to feel bad about it. So I do, I'm under no illusions that closing the black-white wealth gap would completely eliminate the existence of racial prejudice, but I think there are some historical precedents to think that even that would considerably reduce it, which you don't have to reduce it to nothing in order to have made like considerable progress. Like anti-Semitism, as we were just talking about, still exists, but nothing like like when my grandmother was growing up.
Right. The prejudice endures, but the material conditions are different because Jewish Americans are some of the wealthiest ethnic groups in the country, and so they have the ability to secure what they need for their material lives, to be safe, to be well-fed, to be protected, and that's something that Black people could have too.
This has been a free public preview of a patron-exclusive episode of Give Them an Argument. To get the rest of this episode and every other patron-exclusive episode, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis.